Down the right field line, pretty well hit. LaVarn way is the right way here tonight.
Yogi Berra said it's 90% mental, the other half is physical. My name is Ryan LaVarn, Major League catcher and minor league grinder, and I've spent the last 15 years playing professional baseball while evolving my mindset. I'm fascinated by optimizing that 90%. In this show, I'll talk to elite athletes and mindset coaches about what makes them tick and how they've overcome obstacles in their own careers on the way to finding success. This is Finding the Way. Hey everyone, this is Finding the Way. I'm Ryan LaVarn, your host, and today I am joined by Joelle Rabow Maletis. She was a professional ballet dancer, background dancer in commercials, TV, and movies, and then competitive ballroom dancer for 22 years, now turned therapist. So first she was entertaining us, and now she is helping us with our peak performance. She is the perfect guest for Finding the Way. Joelle, thanks for joining me.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Ryan.
So you are the first professional dancer I have ever had on the show, and as someone who defines awkward on the dance floor, tell me, did you start dancing as a little girl? When did it become a passion for you and something you wanted to do professionally? Or when did that even become realistic? Tell me about that world, because I don't know anything about it.
Yeah, yes, like every little girl, I think of my generation, we wanted to be either a ballerina or a princess or Barbie. I mean, Barbie's back in again, so I think it's okay to say that. But so I started taking dance classes, and then about 11 and a half, 12, I started training to be a ballerina, and I had my first paid gig at 16. So I started my professional career at 16 and with a local company, and slowly worked my way, up through the ranks. And, it was a love-hate relationship. So I wanted to be a ballerina, and I would come home from class or rehearsal at that point in time and say, I hate it, and have temper tantrums and I want to quit. And my mother would say, I just paid for the month. You can quit at the end of the month. The month would come and she'd say, okay, do you want to quit? And I go, no, what are you talking about? Why would I quit? So we did this dance for a long time, all pun intended. And so it was hard. And part of it was I was a good technician and I worked really hard. But I don't know if I had, as you talk about that God-given talent, right? And so it was a struggle. And I had a hard time with it. And so it was an interesting ride for me. And the more I did it, the more my identity was wrapped around being a dancer. And that's really then all I wanted to do. And I don't know if it was because I loved it that much, or if it was, oh, okay, now this is cool, right? Now I'm 16, 17, I'm a professional ballerina. That's a really great chip to have on your shoulder. So that started to drive my career of, okay, there's this coolness factor. And I loved to dance, and then I would struggle. And so there was this up and down component with it.
So I love what you're saying about the up and down, because that's so honest and that's so relatable. And I don't think that anybody outside of maybe LeBron James, who was on the cover of Sports Illustrated in high school and went on to be the best of all time, outside of those few, one in a billion, I think anybody that accomplishes their dream, does something great, has that back and forth, the struggle, the love-hate relationship. What was it about dancing, especially when you were young, that you struggled with?
So a lot of it was aesthetics. I'm 5'2.5", and at the time, ballerinas were 5'8", 5'10". So I was hippie, mouthy, and short. That really didn't make for a great ballerina. So that was part of it. I think because of that, I had an attitude. And I think there were times where I was very coachable. And I think there were times where I was not coachable at all. And that became a struggle. And then as I got older, just the sheer number of years of dancing, the stress fractures and injuries. And then the last piece of it was the aesthetics. As my body changed, eating disorders became part of a way to try and figure out how to fit in, because I just couldn't make my body do or look like what ballerinas look like. So there was this tug, or this push-pull component And so, there are times where I was good and I would get parts, and there were other times where I just wasn't able to do that. And so I think that struggle of never knowing if I was good enough, and then I would be good enough at least to be in the background, right? Or be good enough to at least get paid for a show, but not necessarily good enough to be the star. And so that was a lot of struggle of, I don't know how I fit into this. If I'm not going to be the star and I'm good enough to at least get paid to do this, what does that actually say about me?
If it's okay, I want to dig a little bit
Yeah.
deeper here because, I have a
Yeah.
daughter. She's very young now, but as a father, one of my fears is that as she grows up, she'll have a hard time with body image in our society, and struggle with eating disorders. And I have many friends, 3, 4, 5 friends that I can think of right off the top of my head that have struggled with eating disorders that stemmed from body image or stuff. I don't personally
Yeah.
understand, but I'd like to understand, and I'd like to understand how you were able to get through it, who helped you, what lessons you learned along the way. Either to arm me as a father to try to help my daughter eventually if this ever becomes an issue for her, or as a friend, something, or maybe our listeners may be going through it right now. What helped you get to the other side of that?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I think I want to first, say to all the listeners out there, it's not a female thing. It's a person thing, and a lot of times it's an athlete thing. It's not just women athletes, and I think that that's important. And as we're learning more and more, and men are more and more willing, especially at the collegiate level, to talk about their struggles with eating, we're better equipped to help younger athletes. And so I think that's an important piece, is the destigmatizing. um you know Part of it was that it was acceptable. Ballet, gymnastics, ice skating, right? These are acceptable sports to have this maladaptive behavior. So there was a part of, you did it to fit in. There was a part of doing it to fit the part, or to make sure that your weight was a certain weight. And hopefully this isn't triggering for any listeners, so I'll give that trigger disclaimer. If you want to push pause, put it on mute, whatever. But I was 87 pounds at 5'2", and I was being told to lose another 10.
Oh
It's
my
not
God.
possible. It's not possible,
Yeah.
right? And it was things like, well, you're not going to be on stage. Well, you won't get the lead role. Well, I would have never gotten the lead role anyway. So there was a lot of mind games, and that was just part of the sport. Um, so I think that's changed. I think there's a lot more awareness, and the sports are starting to change and become more aware. And that's really important. We're putting, not necessarily less pressure on aesthetics, but we understand peak performance, health, nutrition, movement, exercise physiology. We understand the mechanics of it so much more, I think, than when I was dancing. To answer your question about help, I didn't get help. And because I was a ballerina, I passed. So, I go to the doctor, and especially as a younger child or teenager, right? I go to the doctor, and it was like, well, you're underweight. And it's, yeah, but I'm a ballerina. They go, oh, okay.
Mm.
It's okay. Don't worry. You'll, right. So I think I was able to pass and hide. And that's where I think talent comes in, right? Is I was talented enough to get through dancing through the eating disorders, and not necessarily talented enough to do all of that and then also be the star, right? So there was these lines of, like, and I say this with love, right? And no judgment. How crazy do you want to be in order to make it big? And that was an acceptable mindset. I don't think it is much anymore, right? I got help years later, and I say years and years later, um, and that came in with having to do some therapy for some career ending injuries, and having to come to terms with, well, what does it mean if I can't dance? What does it mean if I'm not going to look the part? What does it mean if I have to give this up? Right. And so what? Not so what, who cares, but what are you going to do about it? And for me, that was when drama and the trauma started to set in. It wasn't really so much the eating disorder stuff. It's something I still deal with today, and I've been retired a long time. I ended up doing my dissertation and PhD in broad spectrum eating disorders, trauma, and addiction. Go figure. Remember, I'm a ballerina, right? So I studied this stuff, and even now, right, there are moments where I have my moments, and I have to remind myself. The difference is it's not behavior I slip back into for months on end. I can catch myself. I'm like, oh, I'm there again, and it's usually because I'm tired, I'm stressed, something's happened, I'm dealing with my own life. So I think in a lot of ways, the therapy piece helped me learn how to cope now, right? And now I have a very different relationship with food and body image than I did when I was dancing. Um,
Is
yeah.
this may come just from a place of not knowing, but I'm very curious.
Mm,
I've heard alcoholics and Alcoholics
yeah.
Anonymous, once they haven't drank for years, they still call themselves an alcoholic because it's an addiction and it's a constant battle. Would you compare it to that?
I think so. I mean, that was really my research. I believe that to be true. I think it's not so much addiction to the high or the control, because it really becomes about control, right? I need to control my body, my environment, my rehearsal schedule, right? My performance, and I can do that by controlling what I put in my body. So I think in that sense of addiction, yeah, it's about control. It's not necessarily about a high, so to speak, right?
Okay. Well, interesting. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
And thank you for making the distinction that it is not a female thing. And that reminds me, when I was at the Olympics, we, in the dining hall, in the gym, they actually had signs on the workout equipment to say, you need to be eating for performance, not eating for looks or for aesthetics. And even at the Olympics, you would think the top performers in the world at the most competitive event in the world wouldn't need to be reminded to eat accordingly with your goals at the time. But it's something that was present even there. So I just wanted to
Yeah.
drop that in. I'd like to
Yeah.
transition to performance and your
Yeah.
mindset. Your mindset. What you said, you got to a point where you knew you weren't going to be the star, and you had to
Yeah.
accept that new role. And that's something I had to come to terms with in my career. And I mentioned LeBron James. Everybody except for Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant had
Yeah.
to come to the acceptance that they are not going to be the star at some point. I think all of our listeners can relate to that. Talk to me about that transition for you. And then
Yeah.
once you weren't a ballerina anymore and you continued dancing in commercials and TV, the transition,
Mhm.
how did that mindset work for you and how did you remain successful?
Yeah, so many questions. They're all great, and my daughter's a little older, but I currently have a daughter that's a D1 athlete, and so going through that now as a parent with her having those same struggles, right, is is very interesting because it brings my own garbage right back up.
Yeah.
So, um, you know, I think ballet to other forms of dance. The other things I did were, I think, in a lot of ways, to me, equally impressive. I had more fun. I had more fun dancing in commercials and movies and music videos and things like that than I did in ballet. So there was a fun component to it, which I think made the transition easier. And because I was still an elite dancer and I was still a professional dancer, that was an easy transition, right? It wasn't hard to give up ballet per se because I had done it. And the friends of mine who were way more talented than I were, they did much bigger things. They went on and did Broadway. I mean, they did amazing stuff. Some of them were not ballerinas. And so what was interesting is it was the grass is always greener. Like I always wanted to do that. Like, oh, I wish I could be on Broadway. And they would say, oh, I wish I could have danced ballet. So I think it was interesting with staying in the dance world. That was an easy transition. The transition for me happened when I was no longer, quote, a dancer, air quotes, right? And then it was like, well, now I'm going to psych school, and I have very young children. When I finally retired, I was no longer, once I finished psych school and I started seeing patients, I was no longer coaching. And so I actually retired completely from the dance world. That was a much harder transition because I didn't know who I was. And so even though I had begun this new career and I had, a beautiful family, I actually didn't know who I was. And there are moments now where I still wake up and I go, oh, wait, I'm not dancing today, and that's my biggest piece of advice, right? Is that we're so much more than our sport. And when that's all we do, right, our entire identity is wrapped up in our sport. We eat, we breathe it, we bleed it. We don't transition well when we no longer have it. So that was the biggest struggle. And it came to a decision point of, did I want to dance? Right? If I couldn't be the star, did I still want to dance? Did I love it enough where I was willing to say, okay, I'm okay being in the background, and that may be the best I'll ever get, right? And is that okay? Or do I want to quit? Because there's a point where we peak, right? We all peak as athletes. And it's like, you can get better mentally. We can play the game better. We understand it better. We're more mature in the way that we handle our wins and our losses. We continue to grow as athletes. And yet, as we get older, our body starts to, perform slower, right? So we can't compete necessarily with the 18-year-olds that are coming up. And so part of it was, where do I want to fit in? And there was a lot of soul searching. So for me, it was, I want to be a dancer, because at this point I did love it, right? I was out of ballet long enough and I didn't want to quit. I wasn't ready. And then I was forced to. And so that was a whole different thing, with a lot of body betrayal, because I didn't get to leave on my own terms. I had to end. Yeah. And so that was different.
Okay, so before we get to the injury, and I do want to get to that, but you're talking about your body peaked, but your mind could still take you to the next level. And that's really what this podcast is about, is, I say in the intro, Yogi Berra said the game is 90% mental and the other half is physical.
Right.
In my career, as my reaction time started slowing, as my strength started in my late 20s, early 30s, I actually improved because of what I did between the ears. I became a leader on the team. I understood my role in developing the young players and talking and sharing my experiences. How does that translate to dance?
I think it's similar in the sense of, you become a leader. I think that a lot of it is just relaxing in the level of expertise you've developed. And so you're not fighting every day to have a spot or to be in the starting lineup or whatever it is, right? Because there's a lot of similarities between sports and dance in that sense. I think, for me, it was learning how to coach, doing some choreography. So starting to do other components of dance. And I think the more I relaxed in my ability and became comfortable in my body and comfortable in what I could do, and I stopped worrying so much about what I couldn't do, I became a better performer. I was much more relaxed. I was more, I liked it more, and you could see that, right? You could see that in my performance, as opposed to being a kid and just trying to make it where you're clenched all the time, right?
I'm listening to you talk, and it is reminding me of just what it takes to be cool, right? You stop striving to force something. Your words were, you relaxed into your own ability. You relaxed into your level of expertise, and you stopped worrying about what you couldn't do. That's the it factor. That's the it factor. You had it. That's so cool. To me, that's finding flow. That's finding the zone. And I love the way you described that right there. So thank you for that and putting it so concisely. At the end, you had career-ending injuries.
Yeah. And
in dance, at least for someone that's outside of the dance world, it's not something I think about. It's typically a non-contact sport. It's totally self-controlled, unless you're jumping off of stages or whatever. What happened? How did you deal with it? And now you have made a very successful transition into, first it was coaching and now therapy.
Mhm.
How did you make that transition?
Yeah, so it's so dance injuries are similar to any kind of impact. So basketball, like any kind of jumping impact type injuries. So um, a lot of compression. So compression based injuries with back and neck, shoulders, a lot of joint injuries. What did it for me is that I had constant broken toes and constant stress fractures in my feet, and they just weren't healing. And so it got to be a point where it was so painful. And the more time I would take off and try and rehab, the more time I lost. And that's part of this, when you talk about the it factor, the other side to that slope is when you start getting hurt, right? And the time that you're taking to rehab, you're losing playing time, right? Or dancing time. Um, there comes a point where you can't catch up, right? And so that started to happen, is that I couldn't catch up. And that wreaked more havoc on my mental health than it did on my physical health. Um, where I left at the top of my, the top of my career, the top of my game. And when I started to get hurt, when I was coming back, I wasn't back at the top. And it took so long to figure out that it factor, like you said, right? To just chill out and just enjoy it. And then now all of a sudden I'm back in this headspace of, okay, now I have to really, really work hard. And I wasn't afraid of that, but I was afraid of failing. What happens when I work really hard and then I fail at it? What is that going to mean? And I think that really played a part in not being able to rehab enough to get back to a place of dancing full time.
Yeah, I've seen so many players want to be back on the field before they're ready, and they push it and they end up getting hurt again.
Yep.
And there was an injury myself with my oblique, where they said if you rehab 99% of the way with this injury and come back 1% too soon, you start back at zero. So I've definitely experienced that myself. Now that you are a therapist,
Yeah.
do you work with athletes now?
I do. I have a very strange practice. So I work with a lot of athletes and dancers, and C-suite, a lot of people that are retired athletes, and doing performance work. But I also work with elite military to do performance work as well. And then I'm a trauma expert. So what I do now is I work with people who have a lot of trauma, and most of them have career-ending injuries. So that's what I do now.
So this is one of my final questions, and I ask everybody
Okay.
before I let them go. And I want to ask you twofold. Normally, I ask if you could speak to a young Joelle, or a person with similar dreams to you that's young, that is has their whole career ahead of them, and I would say, what is your best advice for that person? And as a second facet of the same question, the people that you work with now, your clients that are maybe older, what's your best advice for them?
Yeah, my best advice to my younger self, to my daughter every day still, since you're a parent of a daughter, um, and my son actually, who's a little older, uh, is play hard, play strong, and most importantly, and I make them say it with me, have fun. Play hard, play strong, and have fun. It doesn't matter what the outcome is, right? And it's their deal. It's their career. It's their sport, right? Do it at whatever level you want. And when it's not fun anymore, reevaluate. But your life is more than just you being an athlete. So that's the advice I give to my younger self, which is it didn't matter if you were good or not. If you loved it, do it. If you didn't love it, don't do it. Right? Is it really worth it? The advice I give to my clients now is that it piece, right? Which is, you know, and so what? Not and so what, who cares? But in the moment, constantly, when you're in the game, when you're trying to do your visualization before the game, um, whatever it is, ask yourself, and so what? What do you need to do in this moment right now? Is it take a deep breath? Is it visualize what the play is going to be, or the dance sequence, right? I work with mostly athletes, right? So, visualize what you need to do. What do you need to do right now? And most of the time it's take a breath, roll your shoulders back, turn your head a little bit and go, you got this. Right? Telling yourself, you got this. It doesn't matter what the outcome is. You got it. And what I find is as you relax into like, I've got this. I actually know what I'm doing and I can trust my body to do what I have trained it to do, right? That amazing muscle memory, it'll do it. It'll just magically perform, right? Our head gets in the way of that.
Absolutely. That reminds me of the inner game of tennis, right? The player A versus player B. Very cool. Well, Joelle, thank you so much. I really appreciate, your journey of self-discovery, recovering from trauma, 22 years of dance, teaching athletes, being at the top, being at the bottom, and that it factor that you described so well. So this has been Joelle Rabow Maletis. I'm Ryan Lavarnway. You have been listening to Finding the Way, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Finding the Way with Ryan Lavarnway. Find previous episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.